Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Walsh, Senior Media Officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Thank you for joining us for a public briefing for the recently released report, Integrating Clinical Research into Epidemic Response, the Ebola Experience. You can download a copy of the report and other supporting materials, including today's PowerPoint slides at www.nationalacademies.org/epidemic clinical trials. And you can follow the conversation about the report on Twitter at #EpidemicClinicalTrials. For those of you not familiar with the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, we are private, nonprofit institutions that provide independent, objective analysis and advice to the U.S. to solve complex problems and inform public policy decisions related to science, technology, and medicine. The National Academies operate under a congressional charter to the National Academy of Sciences that was signed by President Lincoln in 1863. For each requested study, panel members are chosen for their expertise and experience and serve pro bono to carry out the study statement of task. The reports that result from the study represent the consensus view of the committee and must undergo external peer review before they are released, as did this report. For today's briefing, we'll start off with some opening remarks and a summary of the report, and with the remaining time, several members of the committee that wrote the report will answer some questions that you have. Please note that this briefing is scheduled to last for 1 hour unless we run out of questions beforehand. Lastly, I want to go over a few technical aspects of the webinar. After opening remarks, we will begin to take questions through the Q&A box located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in your question in the box at any time and click Submit. We ask that you leave this box open and set to your questions to all panelists. And if you have any technical issues during the event, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. Once again, that number is 866-229-3239. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Victor Zhao, President of the National Academy of Medicine.
Well, good morning, and thank you all for being here today, virtually or physically. I'm Victor Zhao, the President of the National Academy of Medicine, formerly known as the Institute of Medicine. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this public release of the National Academy's report entitled Integrating Clinical Research into Epidemic Response, the Ebola Experience. As you all know, in 2014 to 15, the world saw the deadliest Ebola outbreak in history, with over 28,000 people infected and over 11,000 deaths. Ebola destroyed lives and families, ripped at the social and economic fabric of Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and the West African countries. You know, there were significant problems in preparedness response, from a surveillance system that didn't produce an early alert to an inadequate response at the community, country, and international level. Critically, the crisis exposed challenges in research and development of medical products, which are so essential in tackling these outbreaks. So when the epidemic began, there was no approved Ebola-specific therapeutic agent or vaccines, although there were several candidates with preliminary data from preclinical studies and non-human primates. Under urgent circumstances, the WHO, World Health Organization, along with researchers, healthcare workers, humanitarian aid agencies, funders, community leaders, and government officials worked together to implement clinical trials in order to find a safe and effective vaccine or therapy to stem the epidemic. As the committee noted in its report, and I quote, "The fact that these trials were conducted at all is a demonstration of the ability of researchers, regulators, review boards, and committees to work quickly together when the need is pressing," but it was certainly not easy. The trial teams faced immense logistic obstacles while trying to design, implement trials in West Africa in the midst of a rapidly spreading, highly dangerous, contagious disease. And the limited health and research infrastructure were just some of the barriers that had to be addressed. There's a great deal of mistrust of research by the affected communities. And to make things worse, various groups capable of conducting, overseeing clinical trials could not agree on the right trial design, including the use of controls, randomization, which the patient could be offered the opportunity to be enrolled. So a global debate ensued concerning the ethics and the proper conduct of clinical research during the crisis. First and foremost, stakeholders debated whether it was ethical to conduct clinical trials, particularly randomized controlled trials, in the midst of a public health emergency. On the other hand, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for evaluating safety and effectiveness, and so some stakeholders argue that it would be unethical not to do randomized controlled trials. Others argue it would be unethical to deprive patients of an agent that could potentially prevent or treat Ebola, given the high mortality and lack of known available treatment. So you can see how controversial this issue is. And so, as you will hear, despite the heroic efforts in planning and conducting these clinical trials in the midst of formidable challenges, there's considerable room for improvement and much that needs to be done for the future. That is why in 2015, the Office of Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and the FDA and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services came to National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine with a charge to develop a study and report to assess Ebola clinical trials and make recommendations for how research during such public emergencies could be conducted in the future. Now, the National Academies have long history on tackling on challenging, contentious issue, and the report being released today is no exception. As we like to do with all our work, this study drew on diverse group of expertise in clinical research, biostatistics, infectious disease, clinical care, bioethics, and community engagement. You'll soon hear the findings and recommendations of this 16 outstanding member committee, which you no doubt understand why diversity was so crucial. It is essential that voices around the globe be represented, not just in providing testimony, but also in making up of the committee crafting the conclusion and the recommendations. So the committee has representation from US, Canada, UK, Denmark, Nigeria, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. The committee was expertly and effectively led by two co-chairs, Dr. Jerry Kirsch from Boston University School of Medicine and Public Health, and Dr. Keith McAdam from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They dedicate a year to this very important topic of how best to conduct clinical trials in the midst of an emerging or re-emerging infectious disease outbreak. And they were supported by dedicated, outstanding staff team, Patricia Cuff, Michelle Manger, Emily Buster, Michael Berrios, Ann Claiborne, and Andy Pope. So after much information gathering deliberation, the committee developed 7 recommendations that you hear about, and these recommendations will help prepare the global community for the next infectious disease epidemic and enable sound clinical trials to launch much faster. This is our best chance of identifying new vaccines and therapies that will improve our ability to respond to infectious disease outbreaks and provide care for future populations. I just want to express my personal gratitude to the committee, to the staff, and particularly to the co-chair, Jerry Kirsch, who's here today, and who will walk you through the report of his recommendation. Jerry?
Thank you, Victor, and good morning to all. I will run through the important messages from the report, hit on the results of the trials that were initiated during 2014-15 in the 3 countries in West Africa, the factors that shape the outcomes, and then move on to what the sponsors actually asked us to do, which is to think about how to do better the next time. So let's begin. There were a number of key messages that come out of our deliberations. First, which is reflected in the title of the report, is that research actually has to be integrated into epidemic response, and that planning for research and response both begin before an outbreak occurs. That is, in an interepidemic period, it's an opportunity to begin the preparation. We learned that community engagement and active participation in planning and implementing research, clinical research, is very critical. That messages to the community must come from trusted messengers. If the messenger can't be trusted, there's little chance the message will be trusted. We observed that while it's critical to learn from the past, it's also essential to adapt that learning to the context in which these outbreaks are occurring. That it is both ethical and feasible to conduct clinical research during an epidemic, including randomized controlled trials. That research must be scientifically rigorous, designed to produce usable information. That capacity building, which is required, spans healthcare, public health, and research. It's not just limited to the research end of it. That local, national, and international actions must link to a coordinated and agreed upon plan. That investment in achieving this now is critical to improve future performance. Our take on this is that outbreaks will happen. Again, it's simply a question of when, what it's due to, and where it might be, but it will happen. And therefore, we will pay now, or we will pay much more later, and that later is both in terms of finances as well as in the human toll of morbidity and mortality. And that better coordination and cooperative engagement among research and development agencies, and this applies to both within the U.S. government as well as internationally, can help assure that the goals can be achieved. Now some of the details. As Dr. Zhao said, the study sponsors were the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS, the Food and Drug Administration, and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. The names of the committee, I'm not going to run through them. You can see this later. Several of the committee members are on the phone, ready to answer any questions you may have later. And what the sponsors asked us to do was to assess the trials that were performed in West Africa, specifically in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia during 2014 and 2015, and to make recommendations that would improve and speed up clinical research during future infectious disease outbreaks. The committee began its work in February of 2016. During the period of time from February through November, we held 3 public workshops, one in Washington, one in London, and one in Monrovia, Liberia. These were multi-day public workshops with multiple people presenting information to us. We had 6 closed committee meetings from February through November. There was an incredibly comprehensive literature survey. We reviewed written submissions that were sent in to the committee. The report went through extensive external and internal review. And just to reinforce that our goal, our primary goal in working on this is to improve future performance. The context is as follows, and Dr. Zhao alluded to it. It was recognized in January 2014. Actually, by 2 weeks into the month, local health officials realized that there was a continuing chain of cases with a rapidly progressive and fatal illness among family members and healthcare workers, and that this was an unusual finding. The report went up to the Ministry of Health in Guinea. A team was sent out to investigate, and for a variety of reasons, they thought this was cholera, with which they had had some experience. And it wasn't then until March of 2014, 2 months later, that this was actually confirmed to be Ebola. Over the next several months, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, was the major humanitarian group involved in trying to provide care and outbreak control, influenced by the experience on the ground as they were experiencing it. They said this was out of control. The colleagues in the World Health Organization, who were influenced primarily by past experience, said that This was consistent with what had happened before, and they designated it a level 2 or moderate event, which called for a moderate response. This ultimately delayed the designation of a public health emergency of international concern, which is abbreviated PHEIC, until August of 2014. Another 5 months of time elapsed because it's the declaration of an emergency of international concern that really initiates the international mobilization and the response. The result was the largest Ebola outbreak ever experienced since the virus was first identified in 1976. More cases occurred during this outbreak, and if you can look at that insert in the middle, you can see the progression of cases over time. That ultimately almost 29,000 people infected, well over 11,000 lives that were claimed. And at the beginning of the outbreak, there were no approved Ebola-specific vaccines or treatments, but a long list of potential candidates for clinical trials, and some 60 or 70 were proposed and were whittled down to a list of about 20 at the very beginning. This shows the timelines of what happened. For the therapeutic trials on the top and the vaccine trials at the bottom. At the extreme left, at the vertical axis, is the beginning of January. The first dotted line shows when Ebola was confirmed. That's 2 months, 2.5 months from the time things got started before it was recognized. The next vertical line is the declaration of the emergency of international concern. That's another 5 months. And then the three graphs in red, green, and blue are the three countries and the number of cases and the increase in cases, and when they peaked and when the cases started to come down because of control efforts. And on the right, well after the outbreak started to diminish, and on the downslope is when the clinical trials were actually initiated. So you can see right away that the delays that were encountered meant that clinical trials got implemented at a late stage in this particular outbreak. And even though we can say that from the time that they were considered, which really didn't begin until September of 2014, to the point at which they were implemented, a period of some 4 months to the beginning, that's lightning speed in moving from asking a question and implementing a trial, and lightning speed was just not fast enough. And this was the key challenge that the committee has tried to address. Once the emergency was declared, the conditions were chaotic on the ground. Clinical and public health needs were foremost, and they clashed with the desire to implement clinical research to see if there were any products, whether therapeutic or vaccines, to treat or prevent Ebola could be studied and determined whether or not they were effective. In the three countries, there was a limited capacity in the healthcare system. They had no prior experience with Ebola and limited to no experience in doing clinical research. There were missteps in the messaging and the resulting control efforts, and the failure to engage the community not only led to, but fed into fear, rumors, mistrust, and in some instances, violence. During the summer, healthcare workers, expatriate healthcare workers who were involved in care of patients, some of them came down with Ebola, were evacuated, and received on an expanded access basis some experimental therapeutics. They also received exceptionally good clinical care. And when they survived, it said these interventions are effective, they're available to Americans, they're not available to Africans. There were significant disagreements about the priority for patient care versus research. The stakeholders among themselves disagreed whether it was ethical and feasible to conduct randomized controlled trials, and the research groups were poorly coordinated. They competed for trial approval and trial sites, and as you saw, we're doing this as the case numbers diminished. So we addressed whether or not it's ethical to do research during outbreaks. And in this assessment, we considered 7 critical moral principles. Is the study of scientific and social value? Does it show respect for persons? Is the community engaged? Is the concern for participant welfare and interests manifest? Is there a favorable risk-benefit balance? Is there justice in the distribution of benefits and burdens? And would there be post-trial access to whatever product was shown to be effective and safe? Some of our conclusions on this, and I would refer you to the report for a deeply thoughtful and easy-to-follow argument about each of these points, that the same longstanding substantive requirements for the ethical nature of research apply to research in an emergency context. There's nothing different about that, although the assessment and the approval of these trials can be expedited. So we can move faster without sacrificing any of the principles of ethical research. That randomization is necessary in most cases to get interpretable results. This is a fundamental ethical requirement, and randomized controlled trials are the fastest way to identify beneficial treatments and vaccines while minimizing risk. Trials without concurrent randomized controls do not allow the identification of incremental learning. They are really designed to have a spectacular result, or they can't detect an effect. So moderate efficacy, which is the reality of most clinical trials, can only really be assessed with a randomized controlled trial. The assessment of the therapeutic trials, and there were 5 of them, and if you just move your eyes over to the right, the results, inconclusive, 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 inconclusive. These were non-randomized, single-arm trials using historical controls. And the report will detail why it is that this leads to inconclusive results. 1 randomized clinical trial, controlled, the one at the bottom, was very suggestive. It was introduced too late to have enough cases to be able to identify conclusively that it worked. The issue here is that single-arm trials, which is what were proposed for the most part, are always a gamble, and they're usually a losing gamble, and that's what happened in 2014, 2015. The assessment of the vaccine trials you can see, is that 1 of the 4 showed some evidence of protective effect. Our analysis of the details of the study are not conclusive, but they certainly are suggestive. There's some ongoing analysis of the other 3 trials, but they will not be able to identify efficacy. They will help us with whether or not a vaccine produces an antibody immune response and whether or not they are safe. The result of all of these 9 clinical trials, of the 5 therapeutic trials and the 4 vaccine trials, 0 conclusive results for the therapeutic trials, 1 vaccine candidate with a probable protective effect. How do we do better? So the implementation of clinical trials requires that there is a capacity at the clinical level, at the public health level, and the research level, and that these are integrated from the very beginning. And so we strongly believe that clinical research must be integrated into thinking about response from the very beginning. Every country needs a well-integrated, functional healthcare, public health, and health research system. Community engagement is essential. The results of the trials in 2014-2015 document that local communities can both understand and accept research concepts like randomization and consent, but it takes time for them to get to that point, and it takes an understanding of local beliefs, traditions, and customs, the right message, and the right messengers. How can we do better the next time? Based on this analysis, our recommendations address three main areas: capacity strengthening, community engagement, and international coordination and collaboration. And they span the inter-epidemic period as well as what might happen in the next outbreak. We need to strengthen the capacity of health and research systems. Some of this relates to the international health regulations, which mandate every country has the capacity to identify and diagnose an outbreak and has a responsibility of rapid reporting to the WHO so that coordinated international activity can be mobilized as necessary. The countries need support to improve and monitor their capabilities for sustainable surveillance, for diagnostic testing, and basic epidemiology. This was one of the areas where there was a failure in what happened in early 2014. WHO has a responsibility for this. It requires money, and it requires people, and it needs to be addressed. We need to integrate clinical research into the national clinical and public health systems and emergency preparedness and response before the next outbreak. We need plans and we need resources to support the collection and sharing of clinical, epidemiological, and research data. We need to ensure that capacity strengthening is not limited to services that solely benefit study participants, but are available to the community. And we should establish banks of experts who are able and willing to advise on improving ethics review, negotiation of legal agreements, and develop templates that countries could refer to for clinical trials. And this involves national governments, research institutions, development agencies, humanitarian organizations, international and regional bodies, and I should add, international non-governmental organizations as well. We should prioritize community engagement. We need to learn how to do this and how to do it better. We should include social scientists on the research teams to work with communities. There needs to be coordination with national authorities and other research and response teams on social mobilization. And in order to do this, we need to provide support and training for local leaders and organizations. And that will require funding of training and research into issues around engagement, cultural competency, and communication. Advanced planning and international collaboration will be essential when something happens, or, as we colloquially said, when the rubber hits the road. So we have thought that there needs to be a coalition of stakeholders who can work during the inter-epidemic period on planning to prepare for a future outbreak, which involves identifying priority pathogens for research and development, develop trial design templates, collaboration agreements, to experts. So these are available to be deployed when an outbreak strikes. This coalition needs to be independent, expert, free of conflicts of interest, and able to make timely decisions. When an outbreak occurs, this coalition should be able to establish a rapid research response work group to appraise and prioritize the candidates for trial, select the optimal design, monitor and evaluate the trials that will be conducted. So for the next epidemic, we need a fast, nimble mechanism with the right expertise and representation to set research priorities and the research agenda. And it must be established in advance of the next outbreak. It would look something like this. the international coalition of stakeholders with multiple participants that is prepared to organize a rapid research response work group when an outbreak is declared, which has the expertise for the pathogen of concern, the research and development of investigational interventions, trial expertise, design, ethics, regulatory review, community representation. We considered three models for this kind of an international coalition of stakeholders: the World Health Organization, the Global Health Security Agenda, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. WHO is an important participant and needs to sit at the table. I alluded to some of the limitations that WHO has in resources and depth in research staffing. We did not think WHO had the essential characteristics necessary to lead the clinical research effort, but had to be participatory. The Global Health Security Agenda is a U.S. initiated program oriented towards improving response. Started out as a way to coordinate U.S. government agencies, and now has involved well over 50 countries. It is not focused on research as part of what it does, and being led by the U.S. did not have the kind of independence that we think this needs. And the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations is this new organization that has recently been launched. They have financial resources. They are able to connect with industry. And because of these properties, we thought it had the right DNA for the job, and we like to think of it as a model that should be discussed and how to organize this stakeholder coalition. The whole goal is to look at a slide like this, which shows in red the start of an epidemic, its peak, and the downslope. The vertical axis on the left, to the left of that, is the huge interepidemic period where the opportunity for training and preparation is absolutely essential, so that when something begins, when it's recognized, when it's declared to be an emergency of international concern, the blue horizontal lines are all of the things that need to happen so that we can move the trial initiation to the upslope of the outbreak rather than being on the downslope as happened in 2014, 2015. To best prepare the global community, research should be considered a critical part of the response from the beginning. The research community, other stakeholders, need to work together on a collaborative and coordinated agenda. Effective community engagement and communication strategies need to be incorporated into these plans, and local communities to be included at every step. And funding is needed to invest in global health capacity and security, and this funding needs to be identified. That's the essential quick run-through of the report. I invite you to take a look at all 280 or so pages. The report is available at the link that's shown on this slide, and other resources will be available as well on this line. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you. And yes, I'd also like to remind everybody that the PowerPoint slides from today's presentation will be available on that link as well. So with that, we will open it up to any questions you might have. I ask again that if you can please type in your questions in the Q&A box located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. And please identify yourself and your organization when you type in a question. Okay, we have a question that has come in from John Agrivi. He asks, given the slow pace of development in Africa and the likelihood that the various healthcare systems and public health systems will not be well integrated at the time of the next outbreak, how would another Ebola outbreak be handled?
David Peters to start. David Peters, do you want to start with a response to that? Jennifer, would you repeat that question?
Yes, given the slow pace of development in Africa and the likelihood that the various healthcare systems and public health systems will not be well integrated at the time of the next outbreak, how would another Ebola outbreak be handled?
Keith, would you like to respond to that?
Thank you for that question. Keith McAdam. One of the important goals, learning experiences that we had from this epidemic was the essential requirement to engage communities. And this was all aspects of the local community. So going from president to president, although a great help, was not enough. And it required the engagement of all levels of the healthcare system, the local academic institutions, the faith-based organizations, the civil leadership, and it required capacity building in communication particularly, such that the messages put out on radio and social media are monitored, that there are social scientists involved with this expert management of the community, and communication scientists need to be developed to manage the very difficult communications that go on in the fear of an epidemic. So I've really focused, John, on the local response at the local level. And I think when people come in, research needs to be part of the agenda from the beginning, as we've heard Jerry recommend.
I'd just like to add a thought to what Keith said, and that is I think we recognize the magnitude of the need to build capacity, and if we just focused on, 190 countries need to have well-integrated healthcare, public health, and research systems, and be tuned in and ready to act, and that's not entirely realistic. On the other hand, we need to begin, and we need to begin using what happened in West Africa as an example. I think countries will be impressed with what can be done when there are improvements in their internal systems. And what's been happening and trying to build this capacity now after the fact in these three countries may also be a lesson learned for other countries similarly at risk. But the point is that rather than get depressed at the outset, we should move forward and move as rapidly as possible and make sure that that the public in this country, in developed countries across Europe and elsewhere, and middle-income countries and low-income countries understand the context, why we are such a connected world, and why it means something of importance to all of us.
Jerry, this is Charles. May I add to that?
Please do, Charles.
Yeah, this is Charles Wells. Just to add, I think in the report we highlight the International Coalition of Stakeholders. I believe it's recommendation 7, A and D. We talk about it. And even if we find ourselves in another situation where there's extremely limited capacity, if there's better coordination of international partners, as they're outlined in the report, with what capacity is available at the local level, as Keith was discussing at the beginning, we can get a lot more out of what is there with better coordination of all the key partners, both in between epidemic periods and then as importantly, at the outset of an epidemic.
Thank you. Our next question comes from John Pringle. He asks, what are your impressions of adaptive research design such as Bayesian methods in such crises?
Susan, Roger?
This is Roger Lewis. I think the committee spent a lot of time thinking about the impact of different research design strategies on the success of trials. And in the end, as emphasized in the report, the primary challenges for study conduct had to do with the need to engage the communities. The committee examined many different types of study designs and really agreed that the most important thing is that the basic concepts of rigorous study design be adhered to, such as strict definition of inclusion and exclusion criteria, good data quality, and the importance of randomization as already mentioned. With respect to adaptive design, there are some circumstances in which it may have some advantages, but there are also potential disadvantages in terms of additional design work that needs to be done, which could delay the initiation of such a trial. So in all, the committee didn't draw any firm conclusions regarding the advantages or disadvantages of that approach, but explores some of the possibilities within the body of the report. Susan?
I think I would agree with what Roger said. I would note that most, if not all, of the trials that were implemented had some element of adaptation in them, and I think that will be the case in the future. One has to be prepared for making modifications if things are not rolling out as people expect. But it's very difficult to say in advance exactly what would be the appropriate design in any given circumstance. I think all of these, as Roger said, the key issue is that we randomize, we have an appropriate and ethical control group, and be in a situation where we can reliably identify effective treatments.
And at the same time, going beyond the issues around study design, I think what happened in West Africa proved that it's premature to make assumptions that communities will not accept randomization or controls. It's a matter of how communities have been engaged, how the information is presented, how much you can connect with them, rely on community leaders and community participation. And when this was done, there was a transformation from it cannot be done, we won't allow it in our country, which was where Guinea started, to the full acceptance of a cluster randomized trial of the vaccine. So the assumptions are true if you make no effort to engage the community. Once you do that, the better, and the better is the more ethical science can actually be done.
And this is Roger Lewis again. I would add that the report emphasizes the importance of inter-epidemic work, including the pre-definition of study designs that can appropriately be deployed rapidly, depending on the details of the epidemic that emerges. And regardless of the type of design that is used, whether it's cluster randomized or adaptive or Bayesian or frequentist, that inter-epidemic foundational work is critically important to make sure that a good design is properly implemented at the time the epidemic occurs.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jose Ramiro Cruz. He asked, what is the role of local investigators in research and collaboration and in involvement in the community?
Keith or David Peters, would you address that?
Is David there? Or
sure. This is David Peters from Johns Hopkins. I think that the role showed itself to be absolutely critical, that you need local collaborators as full partners in the enterprise in terms of being full research partners, but also in terms of leading the local discussions both with officials and with communities to be able to bring in the right stakeholders to the table. One of the things that we've learned is that local investigators are also building their capacity to engage with communities and to work closely with government, and that was one of the, I think, positive things that has come out of the experience. And so I would say that there needs to be, we've turned this into also one of the recommendations about the future, about the importance of building up the local research capability and having it part of both the public health and clinical response enterprises, and that there, similarly, that there be training and building of community engagement capabilities for locals as well as international partners working in the area.
This is Jerry. I wonder if Alex and Kathy might join in talking about Alex from the point of view of getting the ethical review of proposed trials in place at the local level and how to build that capacity. And for Kathy, with your tremendous experience in running large field-based trials, what the implications are for building the capacity to do those trials in countries.
So this is Kathy. I will begin with the second part of the question first. I think it's really essential that we train young investigators from the countries themselves how to conduct the studies by actually affording educational opportunities, by going to in-country and conducting educational sessions, by really working to train and to show how these studies can be done by their basic understanding of what study design and study conduct. And I think that the more that we can train young investigators in Africa and Asia and other areas where the outbreaks may indeed occur, that the better off we'll be, because then they will be able to take that information firsthand and begin to do the studies and engage the local people. And so education and mentoring and training of young people in the conduct of clinical research is absolutely essential so that we're ready for the next outbreak, be it Ebola or some other yet undefined pathogen.
And just before Alex gets on, there's a part of the National Institutes of Health called the Fogarty International Center, which has as its mandate to do exactly what Kathy was just talking about in training and helping to build local capacity in low and middle income countries. Alex?
Thank you. This is Alex London from Carnegie Mellon University. Yeah, I think the report has several recommendations, recommendation 2B and recommendation 3, that address the importance of facilitating capacity building for research ethics review in low and middle income country settings. And that includes not just strengthening in-country review capacity, but also facilitating agreements between review boards or review committees in regions so that they can work out agreements ahead of time, so that when there's a surge capacity situation, as we saw in this outbreak, where there's a need for very quick ethics review of multiple protocols or study proposals, that there would already be agreements that would be in place that would allow groups to strengthen their capacity to handle that kind of surge. So I want to re-emphasize that, a cornerstone, I think, of this report is really the importance of local engagement and very meaningful local ownership of participation in research, and that includes research ethics review.
This is Jerry again, just another brief intervention to point out that the Fogarty International Center, since 2001, has been supporting the training of ethicists in low and middle income countries as part of its capacity building activities. And in fact, one of the members of our committee, Dr. Oliemi, he's a pediatrician, was trained in bioethics and has returned to his home country of Nigeria, where he helps to lead more effective and better ethical review and ethical context for research in his country.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Liz Petzold. She asks, a rapid research response work group was discussed. Are there any plans for next steps?
Well, I think there are a lot of next steps that are required. What we are hoping and anticipating and intending is that this report initiates a thoughtful dialogue, starting with the models that we presented and trying to figure out how to go from a model to something that is practical and pragmatic and feasible. As we thought about how to implement some of the ideas, there's a temptation to invent a new mechanism. I think there's a danger in inventing new mechanisms. They need to have currency. They need to have resources. They need to be recognized. They need to be nurtured. And so maybe it's better to repurpose previous organizations to a new task. In this case, the model that we selected, not necessarily the organization itself, but the model looks to us like a pretty good one. And we would like to see the initiation of discussions, conversation, somebody stepping up to take the lead to get this moving, and that we don't stop with discussion, but we take discussion into action. For our part on the committee disbands as of 5 minutes from now, but all of us are committed to participating in further efforts at dissemination of the information to all sorts of audiences. Many of us in the next several months, in fact, are going to be participating in professional meetings within our own discipline. We are on the program to report on what our report describes. We are on the program for a meeting in Africa that is focused on the developing the human resources for health needs. That's part of the capacity building issue here. We will pursue getting this message out. In fact, I know that there are a number of members of the press who are online. We hope that you will help get the message out as well, because this is really important. It affects us in the United States. It affects Keith and his countrymen in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and it affects countries across the world. And I think we need to be acting together and acting vigorously. And the way to get this going is to make sure that people appreciate that if it's not in place, if it doesn't work, the next time it may not be 11,000 deaths, it may be 100,000 or more. the time to act is now. And I would revert back to what we said in the report: pay now and get it done, or pay a lot more later with incredible morbidity and mortality and economic and social and cultural losses that are sustained.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Carolyn Lajeunesse. She asks, we know that from the community level, biosecurity capacities are lacking. Has there been any discussion on building on the West African Disaster Preparedness Initiative, which was sponsored by DOD in Liberia, as a model for building response capacity?
We welcome the efforts of DOD, not only the military in the United States, but military elsewhere had the abilities to move very quickly when resources needed to be introduced into countries. The military and the security component of it are certainly a part of the agenda, and they need to be present at the table and participatory. I don't know if David Peters and his work on the ground in Liberia had any context, and might add to that question, to that response. Oh, okay. I'm just told that David had to leave the call a little bit earlier. Anybody else on the committee wish to respond to that? Nope. Okay.
Okay, then we'll take our last question. This comes from Jose Ramiro Cruz again. Taking into consideration ethical principles 4, 5, and 6, and the past experiences with cultured cell lines such as HeLa and stem cells, what does the panel see as benefits to local participants in trials?
Pepe, thank you for the question. So the issue around Henrietta Lacks is not something I think that we will get into, because the circumstances of today are very different from the circumstances when her biopsy and the immortalization of a cell line occurred. The context is totally different. There is far more transparency, and but it kind of now translates into fair treatment, and when there is what the concept of equipoise, where there's really no clear understanding of whether a proposed experimental treatment or vaccine is beneficial or safe. When you really don't know, the ethics of that say that randomization and controlled trials are the most appropriate way to go. But when something is defined as safe and effective, access to it in a reasonable manner and as rapidly as possible is the way benefits are shared. And I have to tell you that early on in our discussions in this committee, Dr. Nikki Lurie, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS, said to us that if any, so this is in early 2016 when the committee was just beginning. She said that make no mistake about it, that from the very beginning, the commitment of US HHS was if anything was identified as being safe and effective, the commitment was to make it available to all those who needed it. And I think that's the critical issue around benefits as we see it now.
And with that, that concludes our webinar today. Thank you so much for all of you joining. There were additional questions that we weren't able to get to, so I thank you all for your questions. And
respond to them by email.
Yeah, we can respond to them by email. Again, you can download a copy of the report at nationalacademies.org/epidemic clinical trials. Thank you.